Imagine waking up and your body is already starving. Your fingers are numb before you even sit up. And outside, the temperature has dropped so low that 10 minutes of exposed skin could be the difference between a bad day and dying. Now, imagine that this isn't one brutal winter you have to survive. This is every single day of your life, every year, for thousands of years in a row. No heating, no insulated walls, no emergency room. Nothing standing between you and the cold except whatever you could kill, sew, or burn with your own hands. This was ordinary life for our ancestors during the Ice Age. And here's the uncomfortable part. If you were dropped into that world tonight, right now, with everything you currently know, you would probably not survive the week. Not because you lack intelligence, because intelligence alone was never enough. Surviving the Ice Age required a level of adaptation so extreme that most of it sounds impossible to modern ears. And to pull it off, our ancestors didn't just adapt. In some cases, they did things that sound less like survival and more like horror. So let's set the scene, because most people badly underestimate how brutal this period actually was. At the height of the last Ice Age, around 20,000 years ago, temperatures across huge parts of the planet were dramatically colder than anything we experience today. Massive sheets of ice buried entire regions of North America, Europe, and Asia under walls of frozen water taller than modern buildings. And in the middle of all that ice stood a species that had evolved under the African sun. No fur, no blubber, no natural defense against extreme cold whatsoever. Against Ice Age winters, the human body, as it came out of the factory, was completely outmatched. Everything that kept a person alive had to be invented from scratch, taken from another animal, or wrestled from the environment through sheer stubbornness. Which brings us to the first genuinely dark survival strategy our ancestors relied on. Early humans figured out fast that their own skin was worthless against Ice Age winters. So, they took someone else's. Animal hides became the only real barrier between a human body and freezing to death. And it wasn't just any animal. Evidence shows that early humans relied on bear hides for hundreds of thousands of years. Stop and actually picture what that required. To get a bear hide, you first had to kill or scavenge from one of the most dangerous predators sharing your territory. Then you had to strip the hide by hand, cure it, wear it, and eventually sleep inside it. Your survival depended on wrapping yourself in the skin of a creature that, under slightly different circumstances, could have killed you first. For tens of thousands of years, that was about as sophisticated as clothing got. Loose hides draped over the body, functional enough to keep you alive, nowhere near comfortable. And comfort was never really the point, because in cold this extreme, exposed skin doesn't just ache. It dies. Frostbite was a constant looming threat. Blackened fingers, ruined toes, permanent damage from a single afternoon of bad luck. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no do-overs. One mistake in the wrong weather could cost you a hand for the rest of your life, however long that turned out to be. Then, around 30,000 years ago, a tiny invention quietly changed the entire trajectory of human survival. The needle, a simple sliver of bone or ivory, small enough to disappear inside a closed fist, and powerful enough to rewrite what was possible for our species. For the first time, people could sew clothing that actually fit the human body instead of just hanging off it. Instead of draping loose hides over their shoulders, they could layer fitted garments that trapped body heat and sealed out the wind. Clothing made from reindeer hide, fox fur, and other pelts suddenly became dramatically more effective at keeping a person alive. It sounds like a small thing, a needle, but that small invention likely allowed entire populations to survive in places they never could have occupied before. It opened the door to some of the coldest, harshest environments on Earth. And yet, every piece of that clothing still came at a price. Every coat, every glove, every stitched layer meant another animal had died. And someone had spent hours crouched in freezing temperatures, scraping and softening its hide with nothing but stone tools and bare aching hands. But clothing alone was never enough to keep a person alive. You also needed fire, and fire in the Ice Age wasn't the flick of a lighter. It was a resource guarded like a second heartbeat. Wood was scarce or completely absent across huge stretches of frozen tundra. So people burned whatever they actually had. Animal fat, bone, dried dung. Bone itself will burn, slowly and stubbornly. Once it gets hot enough, and rendered fat from a large animal could keep flames alive for hours in the middle of a storm. Losing your fire wasn't a small inconvenience. In cold this extreme, it could be a death sentence for an entire group. So, someone was always responsible for keeping embers alive through the night, carrying hot coals from one camp to the next, feeding the flame constantly so it never had the chance to die out completely. Feeding that flame required meat, and meat meant hunting animals that could easily kill you back. Taking down something the size of a mammoth wasn't a one-person job. It required entire groups moving in coordinated drives, funneling terrified, enormous animals toward cliffs or hidden pits. using little more than sharpened wood and stone-tipped spears against creatures that outweighed a grown man by several tons. A single successful hunt could feed a group for weeks. A single mistake could just as easily end a life in seconds. Now, here's where the story gets darker. Shelter. In large parts of the Ice Age landscape, there were no forests to supply wood and no convenient caves to crawl into. So, humans built with the only large material they actually had in abundance: bone, specifically mammoth bone. Across parts of Eastern Europe, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of entire structures built from mammoth skulls, ribs, tusks, and other skeletal parts. These weren't random piles of debris left behind after a hunt. They were deliberately engineered homes, layered with hides and packed earth to block the wind and lock in warmth. Human beings were, quite literally, building their houses out of skeletons. Picture it, falling asleep inside a dome made from skulls, ribs, and curved tusks, while wind screams across the open tundra outside, snow piling up against walls built from the bones of an animal that once weighed several tons while it was alive. And the only thing separating you from freezing to death is that dead giant's skeleton. For us, that image sounds like something out of a horror film. For Ice Age humans, it wasn't a nightmare. It was simply home. But the darkest theory from this era isn't about what our ancestors hunted or built. It's about what may have happened to their own bodies. At a site in Spain known as Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, researchers uncovered evidence suggesting that ancient humans may have endured extended periods of extreme physiological stress. That discovery led some scientists to propose something genuinely unsettling: the possibility that ancient humans entered a state resembling hibernation. Not true. Bear-style hibernation. Something closer to a dramatic slowdown of the body's activity and metabolism during the harshest stretches of winter. To be clear, this idea remains heavily debated, and plenty of researchers reject it outright. But the fact that serious scientists are even willing to entertain the possibility tells you something about how extreme Ice Age survival may have actually been. Imagine a winter so punishing that your own body had to fundamentally change how it operated, just to conserve enough calories to make it spring alive. And then there's the most uncomfortable truth of all. Not everyone made it. As the Ice Age dragged on, our closest relatives, the Neanderthals, vanished from the Earth entirely. These were people who had spent hundreds of thousands of years adapting specifically to cold European climates. In many respects, their bodies were arguably better suited to the cold than ours were. And yet, they disappeared anyway. Climate instability, shrinking food supplies, and mounting competition for resources likely pushed their populations past the point of recovery. Eventually, an entire branch of humanity blinked out of existence. Modern humans survived. Neanderthals didn't. Scientists still argue over exactly why. Some point to technology, some point to social networks, and the strength of long-distance alliances. Others believe it came down to a combination of dozens of small advantages stacking up over generations. Whatever the true answer is, the outcome was identical either way. Only one human species walked out of the Ice Age. So how did our ancestors survive conditions that wiped out an entire other species of human? The answer wasn't a single brilliant invention. It was cooperation. Archaeologists have discovered tools, ornaments, and raw materials hundreds of miles from where they originally came from. Proof that even in some of the harshest environments on the planet, human groups stayed connected to each other. Those connections meant trade. They meant shared information. They meant support during disaster. And sometimes, they meant survival itself. If one group faced starvation, a distant group might be the reason they didn't die. In a world this hostile, cooperation wasn't some soft, sentimental value. It was a hard survival strategy, and it may be the single greatest survival tool our species ever developed. Put it all together, and the picture that emerges isn't really one of clever, tidy invention. It's one of desperation disguised as ingenuity. Wearing the skins of dangerous predators because your own skin offered zero protection. Building homes out of the bones of giants because there was nothing else available to build with. Possibly pushing the human body toward its absolute biological limits just to conserve enough energy to survive. And watching an entire sister species of human vanish into the cold forever. We like to imagine our ancestors as primitive, simple, a few steps removed from animals. But surviving at this level required something closer to brutal genius. Every invention, every alliance, every desperate adaptation was built directly on top of starvation, frostbite, and fear. One freezing night at a time. So, tonight, when you pull a blanket over yourself and complain that your room feels a little cold, remember this. Your ancestors survived winters so brutal that they wiped out an entire other species of human. They wore the skins of the dead. They slept inside actual skeletons. They endured conditions that would kill most people alive today within a matter of days. The reason you're warm and safe tonight isn't because humans adapted perfectly to the cold. It's because generation after generation, They simply refused to surrender to it. They kept fighting through winters that should have ended everything. Long enough to pass that stubborn will to survive all the way down to you.